The Galveston flood of September 7, 1900, was one of the worst natural disasters ever to hit the United States. Some 10,000 people died in a single weekend. This is the eyewitness account of one of the survivors, Mrs. Hetty Mae Cox, my grandmother.
Tell me about when you got up that morning.
We had sort of a high tide, so we had a lot of water on the street that morning when we got up, and we all had on our bathing suits.
Well, had the water actually come up from around the bay?
No, this was the Gulf from Mexico. It was just a high tide from winds, but the wind wasn't at a hurricane stage. So we played around in it that morning, and then of course it got worse. The afternoon, as near as I can remember, I would say around 3 o'clock, it got really very bad. They did have a weather bureau, and they did not have any forecast. Nobody had telephones, anything like that. There was no way to communicate with anybody. Rain was pouring down, and as the water did come up faster, you see, as the wind blew. And my mother said, well, let's go upstairs. We had a 2-story house. And we went up the stairs, and we looked up at the sky, and there wasn't any roof on our house.
In Galveston, a tram line used to connect Bath Avenue and Beach Line. For 5 cents, passengers could enjoy a trolley ride along the surf. During the storm, the waves destroyed the tracks, and the wood trestles became a deadly battering ram, destroying street after street as terrified residents fled inland.
And we went next door because that was what we called a high-raised cottage. It was about 10 feet off the ground, and they had them enclosed with like a lattice work around. They didn't have cellars. My mother thought, well, the water wouldn't go up. Our house was only about 3 feet off the ground, the 4, you know. And I guess she thought that the water would not go up that high. So we went over and got in that house, and we hadn't been in there any time when the water came in there. And the only thing I remember in that house was climbing up on a door. Told you I had a little yellow dog named Texas, and I had Texas under my arms. He was a little pooch, and I wouldn't put him down. And so my mother made me put the dog down. And I always remember he just swam away, you know. And of course the dog could swim, but here I was carrying this 5 or 6 extra pounds. See, I think that tidal wave just swept the houses. You see, every house in its path was swept, and everything it hit went with it, because the town from the Gulf and to Broadway, which was about half of Galveston. But the next thing I remember was that I got out of a window, and the window, it was piled up with debris. All collapsed houses is what debris meant in those days.
During the storm, the waters of the Gulf of Mexico were not clear as artists of the time depicted them. They were covered by a thick layer of churning wooden boards and beams, deadly debris grinding in the high-pitched waves of the hurricane.
And I got out that window, but I don't think my family got out, because I never saw them after that. So I felt that the place had collapsed, you see. And I got out on this pile of lumber, which it was. When I had sense enough to think back, I just realized that they were just trapped in it, and I got out. The wind blowing and great big things like doors flying in the air. I can still see like a door coming through like this, you know, through the air. I was lying down flat, and I think because I was caught under some of the wood, and my one leg was completely caught underneath, and I couldn't move. So I was lying down, and I think that's the only reason I was saved. If I'd been up or standing up, I'd have been hit and knocked off into the water. When I came to, I was lying down. My clothes were practically off of me. I didn't have anything on. All I could remember was sort of a little skirt that was part of my bathing suit, and when I did first realize where I was, the rain was coming down very hard then. And there was one person, I only met one person that whole night, and I thought it was a little boy who was sort of drifting by on another part of this wood, and I remember asking him where he was going, and he said he didn't know, and I said, what was I going to do? And I said, I guess I'm going off and die like everybody else. And so then when I did come to, whatever, and so I could look up, and here was this lovely bright night. I don't know how long it was, but the people that rescued me said it was about 3 o'clock in the morning. In the meantime, the water had gone down. That was one of the reasons they thought surely it was a tidal wave. It was so big it just swept everything with it, and then that it receded. Because when these two men came along that picked me up or talked to me, they couldn't carry me, but they helped me, walked me along on top of this, and we finally came to a clear spot in the water. And there was a telephone post or a pole or something big like that, and they stood me up on it, and they held me, and then they pushed me along in the water. As I remember, it seemed to be about a foot deep. And they took me to their house, which was not too far from where we were found. About the only house standing in that whole area. It was a frame house, and it was one of those, what they called high-raised cottages, as I remember, that they gave me a piece of cheese and some pineapple. They probably used everything in the house to give to all the other people. And all I remember was that the cheese or the pineapple tasted like kerosene. Isn't it funny how you can remember such foolish little things? And they took these raggedy clothes off, and one lady in there, I never did find out her name, had a black skirt, just a plain woman's skirt. And they just put that around my neck and pinned it with a safety pin. And then they gave me this little bit of food they had, and I went
to get your arms out.
I didn't need to. I went right to sleep. I asked them if they wouldn't take me to the Ursuline convent where I'd been going to school, you see. And of course the convent was full. It's an enormous building, that convent was. It was a whole full block long, and they just were filled with people. So I guess they just sent somebody down. You could get around. There weren't anything to ride in, but you could walk.
How could they ever break the news to you about your family?
After I'd been at the convent for a couple of days, they'd begun to, they rigged up a little hand printing press in town. And they got word around to places where there were people, refugees, and to ask if they'd please report the names of all the refugees to the paper so they could publish it. The first thing I knew was my uncle came to get me into the convent.
Hetty Mae's father was a brave man named Walter Bruce Tuckett. He didn't survive the storm. Here he is pictured with his daughter, my grandmother, just weeks before the hurricane hit.
You mentioned how your father had been away at the time.
Well, he was trying to get home.
And
he was working downtown.
To be home and wasn't
well,
able
they
to
couldn't
get
get
there.
through. And this uncle and aunt, they tried to get through. You couldn't, you see, there was no warning. No, my father, I found out that this got as far as almost the house that I was picked up in. And it was a grocery store, and it even took the horse in. Katie was the name of the horse. And Katie was taken in too, but that building went down. They were all lost. My cousin's body was the only one that was recovered. My uncle had gone to the morgue every day and to try to find some of us. Well, you see, it was in September, and it's very hot in Galveston. And they started taking the bodies out to sea and dumping them. And the tide would bring them back. So they couldn't do that, and they had to, thinking of typhoid and all those things, so they had to burn bodies. And they had to burn all this rubbish because all this debris that was around, and many bodies were in that. So that's why they never found anybody, but Lorraine was the only one that was found.
And something like 2,000 people?
10,000.
10,000?
Oh, it was terrible. In fact, they said it was worse than that. They never knew. There was no way to count it at all.
Hattie Mae Cox later married a Texas railroad executive and grew up to live a privileged life in Port Washington, New York. Her daughter, my mother, Margaret Cox, married the New York newspaper reporter J. Nelson Tuck. It was my mother who interviewed Grandma for this eyewitness report on the Great Galveston Flood of 1900.